What Siena found is that when we asked voters to compare New York politicians of today versus New York politicians of 40, 50 years ago, in the voters' minds, there's no comparison. Today's politicians have far less integrity. Their work ethic is not nearly as strong. They don't work as hard for their constituents as the politicians of 40 or 50 years ago. And even on the issue of intelligence, it's sort of even. But voters give a slight edge to the politicians of a couple of generations ago. And so there's this real feeling that the politicians of today are just not as good, hardworking, and committed to the people of New York as the politicians of 40 and 50 years ago. 54% of voters tell Siena that if given the choice, they are so frustrated they would like to throw them all out and elect new leaders, versus 40% of voters who say these are tough times and they're working as hard as they can. But what's particularly interesting on this question is that there's a real difference among voters depending on their party, where they live, and how old they are. Democratic voters, New York City voters, and young voters are much more likely to say these are tough times, they're doing the best they can. But Republicans, independent voters, upstate and suburban voters, and older voters really feel very strongly that these guys should all be thrown out of office and it's time to elect a new bunch of state leaders. Voters overwhelmingly would like to see a constitutional convention in New York. There hasn't been one in 40 years, and by a 63 to 25% margin, voters say yes, they'd like to see a New York State Constitutional Convention. And support for the Constitutional Convention runs across every party, geographic, and every other demographic line. Voters have been telling Siena for the last 7 months that they're not happy with Governor Paterson or the job that he's doing as governor. He had started to increase his popularity ever so slightly over the last 2 or 3 months, but that has fallen again. Right now, 32% of voters have a favorable view of David Paterson compared to 55% who have an unfavorable view. And when we ask voters how he's doing as governor, the numbers get even worse. 23% say he's doing an excellent or good job as governor, but more than 3/4 of voters, 76%, say he's doing only a fair or poor job. Currently, only 15% of New York voters are prepared to elect David Paterson as governor next year in 2010, where 68% say they'd prefer to elect someone else. Well, in a potential Democratic primary, if Attorney General Andrew Cuomo challenges David Paterson, he is way in front right now. By a margin of 65 to 23%, New York Democrats tell Siena they would prefer Cuomo. Even among African-American Democrats alone, they give a 20-point edge to Cuomo over Paterson, the state's first African-American governor. When we look at general election matchups, right now, Rudy Giuliani has a significant lead over David Paterson, a 23-point lead. If it's former Congressman Rick Lazio, Paterson and Lazio are virtually tied. And Erie County Executive Chris Collins, whose name has been floated as a potential Republican candidate for governor, right now the governor, Paterson, only has a very small 8-point lead over County Executive Collins, who is virtually unknown statewide. Well, Kirsten Gillibrand, the junior senator from New York, really has her work cut out for her. She's been senator now for about 8 months, and she's about a little over a year from facing the voters statewide for the first time. Right now, more than half of voters still don't know enough about the junior senator to have an opinion of her, and among those who do, 29% have a favorable view, 20% have an unfavorable view. If she's matched up against Long Island Congressman Peter King as her Republican opponent, right now she has a fairly good lead, 46 to 24%, although she's not over that magic 50. And if former Governor George Pataki, whose name has been suggested as a potential opponent for Senator Gillibrand, right now Pataki has a lead over Gillibrand, 42 to 39%, according to the most recent Siena poll. Siena asked voters who or what is most to blame for the large deficit New York is currently facing in the current year budget. And what voters told us is that 40% of them, the number one choice, blame the national recession. Another 32% of voters blame the state legislature. Only 5% of voters blame Governor Paterson, and 4% of voters blame President Obama for New York's large deficit. Governor Paterson has said that he wants to close the deficit without raising any new taxes or fees. And when Siena asked voters, do you think the governor will be successful in that effort, overwhelmingly, more than 3/4 of voters told Siena they don't think the governor will be successful in closing the deficit without raising taxes and fees. Well, while President Obama has been falling in the polls nationally from his record high numbers in the spring, traditionally blue New York is sticking with the president for the moment. Right now, 70% of New York voters have a favorable view of President Obama. Only 23% have an unfavorable view. Those numbers are virtually unchanged since May, when the president's numbers have been falling nationally, not here in New York. Well, this is an issue, same-sex marriage and whether New York should legalize it or not, that Siena has been tracking in the polls for several months now. Currently, 50% of New York voters say they would support a law to allow same-sex couples to marry in New York. 44% say they would oppose it. It remains a very close and dividing issue among New York's electorate, but right now, a slim majority says they support it.